If there's a hell, I've been there. There's a hell. And the devil turned out to be me. In a room all alone by myself, loving no one and doubting if anyone loved me. I didn't know what I was getting into.
Friends until his last day on this earth. And Howard, at the end of his life, there weren't a lot of people hanging around kissing Richard's.
Believe me, I know in my heart that I wouldn't be here today.
He took care of Richard Pryor. He was there, he sat with Richard Pryor more than anybody.
Among Arsenio Hall's treasure trove of iconic life stories is his first experience doing cocaine. The moment the legendary comedian took the stage at the Comedy Store in Los Angeles in August last year, he pointed to a small booth in the far back corner of the packed room. The spot, Hall explained, holds a special place in his heart, as it was there that he first tried coke at the behest of the late Richard Pryor, who dominated comedy in the 70s and 80s. Hall told the crowd that the two were hanging out at the historic club after hours when Pryor handed him a rock and a $100 bill. As the funny men snorted the illicit white powder, the former late-night talk show host said an oblivious Stevie Wonder played the piano nearby. The Coming to America star quipped that the musician, who was blind, likely thought the duo was battling allergies. Performing at the Comedy Store was sentimental for other reasons too, as Hall explained he'd been cracking jokes there for over 4 decades. After the wildly successful Arsenio Hall show went off the air in 1994 after 5 years, the namesake star stepped out of the spotlight, leading many to believe he had checked into rehab.
Jam I was in, and here was my frustration and my anger. I knew what was going on in Hollywood.
I went on the internet and read I was in detox at Betty Ford, Hall said publicly a few years later. I got online under a fake name and typed in, "I know Arsenio better than anyone else, and he's not in detox, you idiots," he revealed. He ended up taking more time off from showbiz to raise his son, Arsenio Hall Jr., who was born in 1999. The stand-up comic revived The Arsenio Hall Show in 2013, but it was canceled after just 1 season. Pryor, for his part, sadly struggled with addiction. Arsenio spoke highly of his relationship with the incomparable Richard Pryor, who passed away in 2005, as highlighted during his interview with legendary radio host Howard Stern. "Richard Pryor was my hero, and I'm proud to say he was my friend," Hall said. "Richard and I were friends until his last day on Earth, and Howard, he taught me the most about understanding this town. At the end of his life, there weren't a lot of people around kissing Richard's A. This town won't be here in the end."
Say, "Richard, are there other things you want to do?" And he'd say, "There are people I miss." And I said, "Like who?" He said, "Like, I would love to."
The two remained close even after Pryor's health started failing him. Arsenio sneaked him out to see the latest Eddie Murphy movie or brought celebrities and old friends like Steve Harvey and Quincy Jones over for one-on-one chats. Richard's looking at Steve, and Richard said, "I think he kind of looks like me," he recalled. "So I found Steve, put him in a car, brought him to Richard's, left him in the room, and let him and Richard talk for 2 hours. He added, "He was a great dude and he was funny, Howard, to the last day he was on this earth," Arsenio continued, recalling a specific instance where he cracked a joke after being given a Lifetime Achievement Comedy Award. Somebody on the balcony said, "We love you, Richard," and Richard said, "Well, S my D then." When Richard was sick, he was still Richard. Peoria, Illinois wasn't the worst place for a black child to be born in 1940. It wasn't by any means the best place either. Still, it would be comfortable enough for the demanding, extended family Pryor was born into. Abandoned by his mother Gertrude at age 5 after she had taken one too many beatings from his father, Richard Pryor lived in the brothel his grandma ran. His father was her tough pimp son, Leroy, and Richard's mother was one of his hookers, Gertrude. Unlike most of the consequences of this kind of union, he was lucky not to have been thrown away in a box. The young Pryor himself once found a dead baby in a shoebox.
Your mother and father married?
After I was about 3. Yeah, married. I was born Richard Franklin Lennox Thomas Pryor III.
The brothels were profitable, catering mainly to the white folk. Pryor was skinny, gawky, and had a taste for adventure. S was everywhere, and Pryor would look through keyholes watching the Gertrude included, turn tricks, and occasionally take a beating for his sneaky behavior. He'd run errands and talk to the S workers and their clients. His grandma had a rough streak, but Leroy had a rougher one, and his fights with Gertrude were ferocious. Outside, Pryor would lead a reasonably everyday existence. School during the week, church on Sundays. The boundless energy that made him a natural performer in class would get him into a lot of trouble. He got expelled from school and so joined the Army. Pryor's Army career was a struggle, at first stationed at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri for Corps of Engineers training. This base had a bad reputation for being among the most racist in the armed forces. He was later shipped out to Germany, where things got worse. In July 1960, while watching a movie on base with other GIs, a white guy started making jokes about a black actress on screen. One of Pryor's friends started a fight with the laughing soldier. When it became apparent Pryor's friend was losing, Pryor grabbed a switchblade and tried stabbing the man in the back, who didn't even seem to notice. Pryor dumped the knife and ran. He was arrested and thrown in the stockade. It was obvious that the legendary actor and the United States Army would never be a good match, so the brass offered him the chance to depart quietly. Although he had only lasted 18 months, it was enough to change Pryor's outlook on life, and he realized he wanted more than his upbringing had given him.
Totally off drugs?
No, I love drugs. I do, I really do, but I can't do them a lot because it messes my life up. Every time I get in trouble, it's because I end up drinking too much
But he was again stuck back in Peoria, where he started hanging out with musicians and comedians in local bars and clubs. By this point, Pryor realized he wanted to be a comedian. He was working on his comedy routine by playing in small nightclubs in Pittsburgh, where he became friends with a woman who sang in local clubs. He wrote in his autobiography, "Thinking I was a big shot, I told people we were going out and that she was giving me money. Someone told her and she came looking for me, seeking revenge. At the confrontation backstage, I thought she was going to do serious damage to me, so I beat her first. I didn't think about hitting a woman as much as I thought about my own survival." But there's no excuse for such behavior. Her father was friends with some police officers. Pryor wrote, "Pittsburgh was like a small town." He was arrested and sentenced to 90 days in jail for attacking the woman. After being released, the comedian eventually made his way to New York in 1963, where he finally met Bill Cosby. Cosby's less threatening, gentle comedy style had made him a cross-racial hit whose long shadow would intensely frustrate Pryor. That, however, didn't stop him from carefully donning aspects of Cosby's more apolitical act. He found himself on TV, in minor movie roles, and then in Vegas, but would have to edit the hipper bits of his act. The tax man was chasing him hard. He had a $100 a day coke habit, and he was stuck behind Bill Cosby's shadow. Disgusted, frustrated, and very stoned, he walked off stage one night in Vegas. In 1967, Pryor decamped to San Francisco, where he hung with the beatniks and black intellectuals. He snorted coke with the black leader Huey Newton and jazz legend Miles Davis. Pryor's own jazzy riffing style started finding its natural shape, too. It was hip, raw, and aimed right at the jugular, usually his own jugular. The comedian laid his life bare. He'd draw on his childhood, crafting characters from the family, F-ups, and a-holes he'd known from the brothel days, especially the a-holes. No one had ever talked about S like Richard Pryor, lancing his libido and all the macho BS that went along with it.
Then the police came, I went in the house, because they got magnums too, and they don't kill cars, they kill.
He held a mirror up to his black audience's own problems, like chasing women, crap jobs, and getting braced by the cops. It'd be full of familiar characters, and Pryor seemed almost possessed, acting them out. All were uncomfortably accurate and hilariously vivid. His volatile, occasionally violent relationships with women, self-destructive tendencies, and spiraling coke abuse were worn on his sleeve, another featured part of the act. A cult burgeoned into full-blown stardom. Albums like This End Crazy and Is It Something I Said sold millions and won Grammys. He was simply a goddamn funny genius. With a few minor movie roles under his belt, like The Mac, Car Wash, and a few other blaxploitation flicks, Pryor was ready for Hollywood. Hollywood, as it turns out, wasn't prepared for him.
I think the only brave thing I might have ever done in my life was once I worked at a mafia nightclub. in Youngstown, Ohio. I was 19.
Blazing Saddles was a good sign as to how Hollywood would treat Pryor. Having co-written the movie with Mel Brooks, they had to fight to get Pryor his writing credit. The part of the black sheriff Bart, tailor-made for Pryor, went to Cleavon Little instead. Pryor's fiery reputation, busts, drugs, jail time, and gig walkouts had earned him a reputation. Despite an excellent role as a junkie pianist in 1974's Lady Sings the Blues, straight roles eluded him. Only 1978's Blue Collar would harness Pryor's rawness. Written and directed by Paul Schrader, it was a fractious shot of ego clashes, with the improvising Pryor clashing with Harvey Keitel's method of acting. It sank at the box office. A TV show was heavily censored, much to Pryor's public disgust. At least the comedian was funny in 1976's Silver Streak, teaming up with Gene Wilder, but it also condemned him to lovable, hapless parts. Except for Stir Crazy. Again with Gene Wilder, Pryor was back straitjacketed in The Cosby Shadow again in a bunch of classless movies like The Wiz and California Suite with Cosby that somehow made money. He was a confirmed box office draw, but his cocaine paranoia made him notoriously difficult on the set, sending his insecurities into overdrive, turning up late, and endlessly annoying. He took the money and ran as fast as his legs could carry him the other way.
Because I had never thought of myself like that, you know? Because I said, yeah, I've been burned out.
The disregard for his talent may have to do with the fact that by 1979, he'd moved on to freebasing cocaine. He had a heart attack in 1978. In 1980, he accidentally set fire to himself, running down the street a light and suffering third-degree burns. It didn't stop him from freebasing. This brings us back to Superman 3. He kicked the habit soon after filming Wrapped, and the biggest hit of his career followed, with 1985's Brewster's Millions. Still, his career slowly went into decline afterwards. Eddie Murphy, whose debt to Pryor goes without saying, had stolen the march, making the sort of movies like Trading Places, 48 Hours, and Beverly Hills Cop that eluded Pryor. By the time Murphy cast his old hero in the grim Harlem Nights, Pryor was ill. In the mid-'80s, he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and by 1991, he had to undergo a triple heart bypass. He carried on acting until the end of the 90s, when, unfortunately, his multiple sclerosis meant he could no longer perform.
Well, the man that most comedians selected to receive our Lifetime Achievement Award this year is a performer who inspired me personally and a lot of other comedians, Mr. Richard Pryor.
His best movie is a stand-up gig filmed in 1979, Richard Pryor, Live in Concert. Fresh from a run-in with the cops, he shot up the engine in his car with a .44 Magnum to stop his wife from leaving him. It's still awesome, incendiary comedy, stand-up as an art form. It's also perhaps the most influential stand-up ever recorded. Virtually every notable stand-up since has cited it as an inspiration, from Eddie Murphy, Chris Rock, Eddie Griffin, and Bernie Mac, to guys like Bill Hicks and even Tim Allen. In rap, Pryor's lyrical obscenity and social snapshots and occasional gunshots would translate into obscene lyrics and parental caution stickers.
Hi! To do anything. Right? Maybe get petted or something.
He helped enfranchise African-American street slang, which, in terms of style, language, and music, became the most influential pop culture touchstone of the 80s and 90s. Some called Richard Pryor the Michael Jordan of stand-up comedy, but really Michael Jordan was the Richard Pryor of basketball. But the comedian's love life is another chapter that really came mixed up good. The surprising posthumous chapter was added to the legacy of Pryor's infamously chaotic love life, when Quincy Jones, and later his ex-wife Jennifer Lee, claimed that the late comic had affairs with men, including Marlon Brando.
Legendary music producer Quincy Jones broke some unexpected news, claiming Godfather actor Marlon Brando had a relationship with comedian Richard Pryor.
Although his daughter Rain has since denied the allegation, slamming her stepmother as a bottom feeder for supporting Quincy's claims, there is no denying Pryor had a complicated relationship with S and intimacy, subjects the comedian often addressed in his honest and deeply personal stand-up routines. Surrounded by S from nearly the moment he was born, as earlier mentioned, the comedian was raised in one of houses run by his domineering grandmother. It was not an ideal childhood, he told The New Yorker in 1999. When the nuns at his Catholic grammar school discovered the nature of the family business, he was expelled. I didn't care so much for me, but it made my mother cry. She wasn't very strong, but she tried. he said of the incident, adding with his famously dark humor, "At least she didn't flush me down the toilet like some." At the age of 6, Pryor was sexually abused by a young man from the neighborhood. After he became famous, the man came to his trailer on a film set with his son and asked for his autograph. "I was seized by that old sense of fear," he wrote in his autobiography, Pryor Convictions. "The boy was about the same age I'd been when his father armed me. I couldn't believe it. After preparing a lifetime for this moment, I suddenly had nothing to say." Pryor wrote that he shook both their hands and hoped the boy fared better. Although he sometimes dismissed the damage caused by his childhood traumas, his future relationships were often chaotic and short-lived. His first marriage to Patricia Price lasted from 1960 to 1961, and then from 1969 to 1978, he had 3 serious relationships, including 2 two-year marriages to Shelley Bonus and Deborah McGuire. He had 2 children during that time, Renee, the daughter of his girlfriend Susan when Pryor was 17, and a son named Richard with Price. He also had affairs with various film stars like Pam Grier and Margot Kidder, and one with a drag queen he said looked like Josephine Baker. He described the affair in his autobiography, writing, "I discovered that she was actually a he. For some reason, I didn't care. But after 2 weeks of being gay, I went back to life as a hetero-sexual." Pryor, who also struggled with drug and alcohol abuse throughout his life, was repeatedly in trouble for beating up women, according to The New Yorker. Before he had a career breakdown in 1968, he was snorting $100 of cocaine a day, had been arrested for battery, sued for wife beating, and accused of stabbing a landlord with a fork and of beating a hotel clerk.
When you burn up, your skin goes to sleep because nature said, "I can't deal with it."
In addition to the drug and alcohol abuse, his breakups and outbursts were often linked to his own insecurities. For instance, his relationship with Grier ended after, among other transgressions, she beat him twice in tennis. "I love strong, smart women, but I feel inadequate to them," Pryor admitted in 1978. In September of 1977, he was invited to speak at a benefit at the Hollywood Bowl in Los Angeles to oppose Proposition 6, a Californian anti-gay initiative. During his set, he received big laughs from the audience, describing the first time he performed oral S on a man. But the crowd eventually turned on him after his repeated use of gay slurs, and Pryor ultimately walked off stage after inviting the audience to "kiss my happy, rich, black A." One of his most surreal incidents took place the same year, not long after he married McGuire, when he chased his newlywed friends out of his house following a contentious New Year's party. Pryor was booked for assault with a deadly weapon after firing off a number of rounds into one of McGuire's friends' empty cars, which was still sitting in his driveway. Much of the party had already fled from the home on foot. "I don't know why I do self-destructive things like that. I want to learn from my mistakes," he revealed later that same year. While both Pryor and McGuire still felt love towards one another, the blow-up led to their divorce. "A lot of things were said in anger that will be hard to smooth over," she later revealed. "Richard just can't argue. He waits until something gets under his skin so bad he blows up." After the split, Pryor said, "For a long time, I saw women as sexual objects, and I was always trying to keep from getting hurt. Then, one day, they would pack up and leave, taking something more with them than their clothes. They took my happiness." He added, "I've finally gotten to the stage where I am trying to understand women as friends. I'd rather rob a bank than mess with women the way I used to." The comedian never had close relationships with all of his children, but he revealed that after his split with McGuire, they became the most important thing in his life. His daughter Renee, then 20, lived with him. Richard, then 15, lived back in Peoria, Illinois with his mother. Elizabeth, then 10, and Rain, then 8, both lived in LA with their respective mothers. "Last summer, I took them all to Europe. I'm not going to make that mistake again," Pryor said. There was just not enough daddy to go around. He married his next wife, Jennifer Lee, in 1981, but they had first met years earlier in 1977, when she was hired to help redecorate his house. In her early 20s, she had moved to LA to become an actress, starred in several B movies, and has since claimed to have had affairs with Warren Beatty and Roman Polanski. When she first met Pryor, he was blue, heartsick over a woman who was running game on him, she wrote in Spin magazine. He was putting a major dent in a big bottle of vodka. You could feel the tears and smell the gardenias, even with hip, white-walled nasal passages. Since that first meeting, she would be his head bee, as she put it in an interview with The New Yorker. According to the outlet, Pryor saw something of himself in Lee. What no one gets, she told the outlet, is that one of the ways Richard became popular was through women falling in love with him. They saw themselves in him, in his not fitting in, the solitude of it all, and his willingness to be vulnerable as women are, and disenfranchised, of course, as women are. Still, the two fought often, and Pryor's abusive tactics continued. The tragedy was that Jennifer could keep up with me, he told The New Yorker, but their marriage only lasted a year, and by 1982, they were divorced. He got himself sober in 1983 and began performing less. Then, in 1986, he married again to Flynn B. Lane, 2 years after she had given birth to his son, Stephen. They divorced in 1991, and after being diagnosed with degenerative multiple sclerosis, he called Lee for help in 1994. He said, "My life's a mess. Will you help me out?" Lee told The New Yorker. "I thought long and hard about it. I wasn't sure it would last because Richard loves to manipulate people and see them dance. But see, he can't do that anymore because he finally bottomed. That's the only reason Richard is allowing his life to be in any kind of order right now." So she moved back to LA to be with her ex-husband. "When I got there, he was in this ridiculous rental for like $6,000 a month," she told the outlet. 5 bedrooms, 7 bathrooms. Honey, it was classic. You couldn't write it better. Lee helped Pryor downsize his living arrangements and took care of him as the disease took its toll. She married him again in 2001 and stayed by his side until his death in 2005. Throughout all of this, Arsenio Hall stayed close to his friend Pryor, proving just how much they were a match made in heaven. Arsenio, the only son of a Baptist preacher, never quite fit in with the other children in his neighborhood. While they dreamt of becoming Motown singers and NFL stars, he was obsessed with magic tricks and Johnny Carson. As a young boy, he wrote the legendary Tonight Show host a letter and later begged his father to buy him the same outfit Carson wore on TV.
To be a little more conservative, because when Johnny leaves, you want to inherit that audience. And so there was always a fight about, like I remember the first time Ice Cube came to visit me.
When I was a kid, I was the only brother in Cleveland who wanted a Johnny Carson suit, the actor told Howard Stern. Everybody else wanted to be Jim Brown in Cleveland, Everybody wanted to be one of the Temptations. I wanted a Johnny Carson suit. My dad, one September, when we went shopping for school clothes, he bought me a Johnny Carson suit that I wore to church every Sunday. As an aspiring illusionist, Arsenio specialized in what he called dove magic. Performing tricks may have helped him hone a world-class stage presence, but it didn't do much for his social life. "I wasn't the star football player. I was a geek. I was the kid who did magic tricks," he recalled. "No one came close to wanting to give me no pee." Like with Dick Cavett, Steve Martin, and Carson before him, magic ultimately only served as an on-ramp to Arsenio's successful entertainment career. Over the span of a few decades, he would find fame and fortune as an actor, stand-up, and the trailblazing host of The Arsenio Hall Show.
That the legends didn't like. And as much as I walked out with a smile and did the show every night, I was tortured, man.
What inspired him to finally ditch the doves and pursue his true calling? Hank Morehouse, a guy from Ypsilanti, Michigan, who caught Arsenio's act at a magic convention. He said, "Young man, you're a good magician, but you'll become famous when you put the birds away and just talk," the actor recalled. "It's exactly what you said. One day, you get rid of the birds, and the magic was just window dressing for my act." Arsenio's father, Fred Hall, passed away before his son's entertainment career ever really took off, but he did get to see him on TV one time as a magician. "They flew me to New York to do a show called Soul," Arsenio said. "My dad got to announce at the end of church one Sunday, watch my son tonight. He'll be doing magic on television." That was kind of cool. Whether as an 11-year-old magician or up-and-coming comedian, Arsenio spent a significant portion of his formative years trying to make his way onto Carson's Tonight Show. Unfortunately, everyone kept telling him he wasn't a good fit. Back in those days, Tonight Show co-producer Jim McCauley would come to the Comedy Store or the Improv and watch you. He always said, "I'm not a Carson guest." The irony is, he thought I was a Letterman guest, and I ended up doing my first stand-up shot on Letterman, which was very cool back in the day. But you know how comics are. We wanted to get that from Johnny, Hall told Howard, explaining that his Tonight Show breaks actually came by way of comedian and frequent guest host Joan Rivers, who booked him when she could. Speaking of the Comedy Store, Arsenio was excited to see Stern Show co-host Robin Quivers. The two hadn't crossed paths in decades since they hung out with model Jessica Hahn and comedian Sam Kinison outside Mitzi Shore's office at the Comedy Store. "You two did dueling preachers," Robin recalled with a laugh. I couldn't believe it because you guys just went at it. This was a battle between the preachers. Arsenio remembered the evening all too well and revealed the riffing he did that night improbably paved the way for a TV game show concept sometime later. A network tried to do a show called Dueling Pastors, he said. It didn't work, but it was what we did for Robin that night. Hall didn't release his first full-length comedy special until 2019's Smart and Classy, but the entertainer has found plenty of success on stage over the years and worked alongside many of the greats. Howard wondered if there was any comedian's act he didn't like to follow. When I was young, I wanted to follow the best, but now I want to go on first and go to bed, Arsenio laughed, though one name did eventually spring to mind. I hated following Howie Mandel. He was a beast. Howie Mandel got crazy laughs, and I hated following him. Now 68 years old, the actor, talk show host, and comedian is still pushing on. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said of his good friend Richard Pryor, who has since passed, but the memories the two share will forever be cherished. And that's it from us today. Until next time, thank you for watching.